5 days ago, Mike Johnson said he was absolutely delighted that Jasmine Crockett was running for Senate. He rubbed his hands together. He grinned for the cameras. He called her the face of the Democratic Party like it was an insult. Last night in Houston, Jasmine Crockett showed him exactly what that face looks like when it's holding receipts. What happened next is already breaking the internet. By the time you finish hearing this story, the clips will have doubled in views. The memes will have multiplied. And Mike Johnson will still be trying to figure out how a woman he mocked for 5 days straight just ended his career in 2 hours. Before we dive in, drop your state in the comments. Let's see how many people Mike Johnson thinks aren't common-sense Americans. This one got personal. Real personal. When CNN announced a special town hall titled Face to Face, the Texas Senate race, everyone assumed it would be about Jasmine Crockett defending her candidacy. The network had invited Speaker Mike Johnson to represent the Republican perspective, to explain why he was so delighted about her entry into the race, and to make the case that Texas would never elect her. Johnson accepted immediately. Why wouldn't he? He'd spent 5 days, 5 full days, mocking Crockett to every camera he could find. She's the face of the Democratic Party. She and Ma'am Danny. Good luck with that. He said it on Fox News. He said it at press conferences. He said it in hallway interviews. He said it with that smug grin that had become his trademark, rubbing his hands together like a villain in a children's movie. I want her to have the largest, loudest microphone that she can every single day, he told reporters, barely suppressing his laughter. We're going to elect another Republican senator in Texas. Texas is a red state. The people of Texas are common-sense Americans, and what Jasmine is trying to sell will not be purchased by the folks of Texas. He was so confident, so certain, so absolutely delighted. His team prepared him thoroughly, or so they thought. They briefed him on Texas politics, on conservative talking points, on how to frame Crockett as a radical leftist who didn't represent Texas values. They prepared answers for questions about her policy positions, her voting record, her statements about Donald Trump. What they did not prepare him for, what apparently never occurred to anyone on his team, was the possibility that Crockett might not spend the evening defending herself, that she might instead spend the evening attacking him. They did not prepare him for receipts. Jasmine Crockett arrived at the Houston studio with 3 rolling briefcases. Not 1, 3. They were heavy. The kind of heavy that comes from being stuffed with documents, printouts, court filings, and evidence. A CNN producer making small talk before the broadcast asked what was in the briefcases. Crockett smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, warm on the surface, but with something sharper underneath. Receipts, she said. The producer would later tell reporters it was the most ominous single word she'd ever heard in 30 years of television. Johnson, meanwhile, was in the green room doing last-minute prep with his team. They were relaxed, confident. Johnson had done hundreds of interviews. He'd faced tough questions before. He was the Speaker of the House, for God's sake. What could a second-term congresswoman from Dallas possibly throw at him that he couldn't handle? He straightened his tie. He practiced his common-sense American's line one more time. He reminded himself to smile, to look confident, to project the authority of his office. Anderson Cooper moderated. The audience of 400 was split evenly between Republicans and Democrats, Texas voters who would actually be casting ballots in the upcoming primary and general elections. The cameras were rolling. The lights were hot. The nation was watching. CNN had expected maybe 2 million viewers for Friday night political town hall. By the time word started spreading about what was happening in that Houston studio, they would peak at over 12 million, the largest audience for a non-debate political event in 3 years. But none of that had happened yet. At 8:00 p.m. Central Time, when the broadcast began, Mike Johnson still felt confident. It was the last time he would feel confident for a very long time. Johnson opened with the line he'd been perfecting all week. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, leaning back in his chair with practiced ease. "I meant what I said. I'm absolutely delighted you're running. Texas is a red state. The people of Texas are common-sense Americans, and frankly, what you're selling, they're not buying it." He gestured expansively, warming to his theme. "You represent everything that's wrong with the modern Democratic Party. The woke ideology, the radical agenda, the idea that government knows better than families, Better than churches, better than communities. He turned to the audience. Texans don't want that. Texans want freedom. They want faith. They want leaders who share their values. The Republican half of the audience applauded enthusiastically. A few people stood. Johnson nodded graciously, the picture of confidence basking in the approval of his base. "Good luck in your campaign," he added, that smug grin spreading across his face. "You're going to need it." Crockett hadn't moved. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded, that smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The smile that political commentators would later call the receipt smile. The smile of someone who knows something you don't. "Common sense Americans," she repeated slowly, as if tasting the phrase. "I like that. Let's talk about common sense, Mr. Speaker, because you just said a lot of words about values and faith and freedom. But I'd like to talk about something simpler, something even more basic." She opened her first briefcase with a deliberate click. "Common sense says that if you earn $223,000 a year, which is your salary as Speaker of the House, you should probably have a bank account." She produced a document, holding it up so the cameras could see. "But according to your own financial disclosures, documents you filed under penalty of perjury, documents that are public record, you don't have one. No bank account. Zero." Johnson's smile flickered like a candle in a sudden breeze. "That's been explained." "Has it?" Crockett pulled out more pages. "Because I've reviewed 7 years of your financial disclosures, Mr. Speaker. 7 years. 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. And in none of them, not a single one, do you report a bank account." She spread the documents on the table in front of her. "No checking account, no savings account, no money market, no certificates of deposit, nothing. A man who's been in Congress for years earning a 6-figure salary, and according to his own sworn statements, he has nowhere to put his money." She held up another page. "You also report no assets. None. No stocks, no bonds, no retirement accounts beyond your congressional pension. A man in his 50s with no assets. What you do have is somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 in mortgage debt, plus additional loans, plus a home equity line of credit." Johnson shifted in his seat. The confidence was draining from his face. "My finances are perfectly legal." "Where does your money go, Mr. Speaker?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Simple, direct, devastating. "Because I'm a lawyer," Crockett continued, her voice calm and measured. "I spent years as a criminal defense attorney in Dallas. I've seen a lot of financial arrangements. I've reviewed a lot of financial documents, and when I see someone making over $200,000 a year for 7 years straight with no bank account, no assets, and nothing but debts," she paused. "My common sense tells me something doesn't add up." She set down the documents carefully. "You came here tonight to lecture Texas about common sense, but you can't explain basic personal finances to people who actually balance their checkbooks. And Citizens United has filed an ethics complaint about your disclosures. They called them, and I'm quoting, repeated violations of federal financial disclosure requirements." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something almost conversational. "So here's my question, Mr. Speaker. You're absolutely delighted that I'm running, but are you absolutely delighted to explain where your money goes? Because I've been transparent about my finances. I've disclosed my bank accounts, my assets, my debts. I've shown Texas exactly what I have and where it came from." She smiled. "And when will you do the same? Because right now, the only thing I'm delighted about is watching you try to explain why the third most powerful person in America can't seem to find a bank." The Democratic half of the audience erupted. Several people stood. The applause rolled through the studio like thunder. Johnson's face had gone pale. His media training had prepared him for attacks on his ideology. It had not prepared him for an audit. "If you have a bank account and make less than $200,000 a year, type common sense in the comments. Let's count how many of us are more financially transparent than the Speaker of the House." Johnson attempted to recover. His handlers had prepared him for attacks on policy, on ideology, on his conservative record. They had not prepared him for an audit. "Look," he said, forcing his voice back to its confident register, "I'm not here to discuss my personal finances. I'm here to talk about why Congresswoman Crockett's radical agenda is wrong for Texas. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I understand the law. I understand what the Constitution actually says." "You're a constitutional lawyer," Crockett interrupted, "who signed onto a lawsuit asking the Supreme Court to throw out the votes of millions of Americans. And the court rejected it 9-0. The words landed like a hammer. "That was a legitimate legal question about election procedures." "A legitimate legal question?" Crockett reached into her briefcase and produced another document. "Let me read what the Supreme Court actually said about your legal work. Quote, Texas has not demonstrated a judicially cognizable interest in the manner in which another state conducts its elections." End quote. She looked up. 9-0, Mr. Speaker. Not a single justice found your argument worth considering. Not the conservatives, not the liberals, not the ones appointed by Trump, not the ones appointed by Obama. Every single justice looked at your legal reasoning and said no. Johnson's jaw tightened. The court chose not to hear the case on procedural grounds. "They chose not to hear it because your argument was garbage," Crockett shot back. "And you know what's interesting? You didn't write that brief alone. You lobbied over 125 of your colleagues to sign on to it. You put your name on it. You stake your reputation as a constitutional lawyer on a legal theory so weak that the most conservative Supreme Court in modern history rejected it unanimously." She shook her head slowly. "You want to question my qualifications for the Senate, Mr. Speaker? You couldn't get a single Supreme Court justice to take your side on the most important legal argument of your career. I've had better win rates in traffic court." Anderson Cooper looked like he was trying very hard to maintain journalistic neutrality. He was not entirely succeeding. "And that brief wasn't just legally incompetent," Crockett continued. "It was filed on December 10th, 2020, less than a month before January 6th. You were telling millions of Americans that the election was still using the authority of your legal degree, your position in Congress. And then you acted surprised when they believed you." She paused. "Common sense Americans, Mr. Speaker. Common sense says that if you help spread a lie, you're responsible when people act on it. If you've ever won an argument, literally any argument, you're more qualified than the Speaker's Supreme Court record. Type unanimous in the comments." Johnson was sweating now. The studio lights suddenly seemed much hotter than they had 20 minutes ago. He loosened his tie slightly, a nervous gesture that the cameras caught and Twitter would mock for days. He tried to pivot to safer ground, to the identity he had built over decades in conservative politics. "I've dedicated my career to defending religious liberty," he said, straightening in his chair, trying to reclaim some dignity, "to protecting the values that made this country great, to standing up for people of faith against government overreach." "You dedicated 8 years of your career to the Alliance Defending Freedom." Crockett's voice cut through his talking point like a scalpel through silk. "Do you know what the Southern Poverty Law Center calls the Alliance Defending Freedom, Mr. Speaker?" Johnson's face hardened. He'd prepared for this attack. The SPNL sees a left-wing organization that has been thoroughly discredited. "They call it a hate group." Crockett didn't let him finish. "A hate group. And you worked there for 8 years, from 2002 to 2010. You weren't just a member, Mr. Speaker. You weren't just a volunteer. You were a staff attorney. You were a spokesperson. You represented them in court. You helped craft their legal strategies. You were a face of their organization." She produced another stack of documents, thicker this time. "Let me tell you what the Alliance Defending Freedom was doing during your 8 years there. They were fighting to keep homosexuality criminalized. They were opposing anti-bullying programs in schools, programs designed to protect gay kids from harassment. They were defending conversion therapy. They were arguing that transgender people shouldn't have legal protections." She found a specific page. "But let's get into the details, because the details matter. Let me read from a brief you helped write for Lawrence v. Texas, the case that asked whether states should be able to criminalize gay sex, should be able to put people in prison for having consensual relationships with other adults in the privacy of their own homes." She read aloud. "Your organization argued that homosexuality should be listed alongside And I'm quoting directly from the legal brief, pedophilia, polygamy, and incest. Those are the comparisons you put in writing. Those are the arguments you made to the Supreme Court. A murmur rippled through the audience. Even some of the Republicans looked uncomfortable. Comparing gay relationships to pedophilia wasn't a position many of them wanted to defend in public. I was advocating for my client's position, Johnson said, his voice strained. Lawyers represent. You weren't a hired gun, Mr. Speaker. You worked for ADF for 8 years. You believed in their mission. You helped shape their strategy. Crockett held up another document. You wrote promotional materials for them. You gave speeches defending their positions. You didn't just represent their views, you shared them. She pulled out another page. And it wasn't just legal briefs. Your organization partnered with Exodus International. Do you remember Exodus International, Mr. Speaker? They were a conversion therapy group. They claimed it could cure gay people. They worked with teenagers. They told gay kids that there was something fundamentally wrong with them, something that needed to be fixed. She paused. Exodus International caused so much documented psychological harm, so many cases of depression, of anxiety, of suicidal ideation among the young people they treated, that their own founder eventually shut down the organization and issued a public apology. She read from her notes. Alan Chambers, the founder of Exodus International, said in 2013, and I quote, "I am sorry for the pain and hurt that many of you have experienced. I am sorry that some of you spent years working through the shame and guilt you felt when your attractions didn't change. I am sorry we promoted sexual orientation change efforts and reparative theories about sexual orientation that stigmatized parents." She looked up at Johnson. He said he was sorry. He acknowledged the harm. He took responsibility. Her voice hardened. "Have you—" Johnson opened his mouth, but no words came out. The studio was silent. "You spent 8 years arguing that gay Americans should be criminals," Crockett continued. "You partnered with groups that tried to cure gay children, groups that later admitted they caused tremendous harm, that apologized for the damage they inflicted on vulnerable young people. And in all the years since, I have never heard you say you were wrong. I have never heard you acknowledge the harm. I have never heard you apologize." She shook her head slowly. "And now you want to mock me for being the face of the Democratic Party. At least my face isn't on legal briefs arguing to put people in jail for who they love. At least my face isn't associated with organizations that damage children. At least I can look LGBTQ Americans in the eye without having to explain why I spent 8 years trying to make them criminals." She gathered her documents. "You want to talk about values, Mr. Speaker? Here's a value for you. Accountability. When you hurt people, you apologize. When you're wrong, you admit it. That's a value I learned in Texas. Maybe they teach it differently in Louisiana. If you believe love is love, if you think people shouldn't be criminalized for who they are, type love in the comments. Let's see how many people Mike Johnson thinks should have been arrested." The audience was restless now. The Republican side had gone quiet. The Democratic side was energized. And Mike Johnson looked like a man who had wandered into a boxing match expecting a debate. Crockett shifted gears. Her voice became almost conversational. "Mr. Speaker, let's talk about accountability. You've said publicly in interviews on the record that you and your 17-year-old son monitor each other's internet activity through an app called Covenant Eyes. Is that correct?" Johnson stiffened. "That's a private family matter." "You made it public, Mr. Speaker. You talked about it in interviews. You were proud of it. You held it up as an example of how Christian families should operate." She tilted her head slightly. "Here's what I find interesting. The Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, with access to classified information, responsible for national security, has a third-party app monitoring his digital activity. An app that stores data on external servers, an app that could theoretically be accessed by the company, by hackers, by foreign intelligence services." She paused. "And your accountability partner, the person you trust to monitor your browsing habits, is a teenager. Your own son." Johnson's face had gone red. "This is completely inappropriate." "You know who else used Covenant Eyes?" Crockett didn't wait for an answer. "Josh Duggar. The man who was convicted of possessing child sexual abuse material. He was a big advocate for the app, too. That's completely irrelevant. Is it? Crockett's voice sharpened. My point is simple, Mr. Speaker. You've told the American people that you can't trust yourself to browse the internet without your teenage son watching. You need external accountability for something as basic as using a computer. She leaned forward. But when it comes to democracy, when it comes to the Constitution, when it comes to the truth about elections, you answer to no one. You spread lies about 2020 with no accountability. You helped plan the legal strategy that led to January 6th with no accountability. You blurred security footage to protect rioters with no accountability. She let that sink in. Interesting where you draw the line. Your internet history needs a 17-year-old supervision, but your assault on democracy? That's just fine. If you can use the internet without your kid monitoring you, type adult in the comments. Let's see how many of us have more self-control than the Speaker of the House. Anderson Cooper glanced at the clock. They were past the halfway point, and Mike Johnson had yet to land a single blow. Every attempt to attack Crockett had been turned back on him. Every talking point had been dismantled. Johnson made one more attempt to seize control. He straightened in his chair, trying to project the authority of his office. I've always supported the peaceful transfer of power. I've always believed in democracy. I took an oath to the Constitution. You drafted the legal argument that 126 Republicans used to try to overturn the 2020 election. Crockett's voice was calm, almost clinical, like a prosecutor laying out a case. The day before January 6th, she produced a thick folder of documents, her thickest yet. Let me walk through the timeline, Mr. Speaker, because I think the American people deserve to understand exactly what you did. Not what you said afterward, not how you've tried to spin it, what you actually did. She opened the folder. December 2020. The election was over. Joe Biden had won. Every court challenge had failed. Trump's own attorney general said there was no evidence of widespread fraud. And you, Mike Johnson, drafted an amicus brief asking the Supreme Court to invalidate the election results in 4 states, not your state, other states, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. She held up the brief. This wasn't a minor filing. This was an attempt to throw out millions of votes. And you didn't just write it. You lobbied for it. You personally contacted over 125 colleagues and convinced them to sign. You were the architect. Johnson tried to interject. The brief raised legitimate constitutional questions. The Supreme Court rejected it. 9-0. Crockett cut him off. Not a single justice found your argument worth hearing. But that's not the point. The point is timing. She flipped to another page. You filed on December 10th, 2020, less than a month before January 6th. While you were telling the country the election was stolen, people were listening. They were organizing. They were planning to come to Washington. They believed what you were telling them, because people like you with law degrees and positions of authority were giving the lie legitimacy. She pulled out printed screenshots. January 5th, 2021, the day before the attack. You were still promoting this theory, still telling people democracy was being stolen. Her voice hardened. January 6, 2021. They came. Thousands of them. They stormed the Capitol. They beat police officers with American flag poles. They sprayed chemical irritants. They smashed windows. They built gallows. They chanted, "Hang Mike Pence." She read from a document. 140 police officers were injured that day. Brian Sicknick, a Capitol police officer, was assaulted by the crowd. He collapsed the next day and died. He was 42 years old. Her voice dropped. 4 more officers who responded to the attack later died by suicide. Howard Liebengood, Jeffrey Smith, Carl DeFreitas, Gunther Hashidot. The trauma of that day killed them. She let the silence hang. And you, Mr. Speaker, after the riot, after the deaths, after 140 officers were injured, you voted against certifying the election anyway. The lie you helped spread had just gotten people killed, and you doubled down. Johnson tried to interject. I never condone violence. You voted against the January 6th commission, Crockett continued. You didn't want anyone investigating what happened. And then, when you became speaker, you got access to the security footage. She held up a photograph, a still from the footage with faces blurred. And you blurred their faces. The people who beat cops, who smeared feces on the walls, who tried to overthrow democracy. You obscured their identities so they couldn't be prosecuted." Johnson's voice cracked. "I released the footage to the public with faces blurred. You made it harder for law enforcement to identify criminals. You protected the attackers." She set down the photograph. 140 officers were injured. 5 people died that day. 4 more officers died by suicide. And you, the man who helped create the lie, blurred the faces of the attackers so they couldn't face justice." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "You said you're absolutely delighted that I'm running for Senate. Mr. Speaker, you should be absolutely delighted you're not in prison. If you remember January 6th, if you remember the officers who defended democracy while the Speaker tried to hide the evidence, type the date in the comments. Let's make sure we never forget." Johnson looked broken. His tie was loose, hanging at an angle that would have horrified his handlers. His face had lost all color. Sweat stains were visible on his shirt collar. The confident man who had walked into the studio planning to mock Jasmine Crockett was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he was counting the seconds until he could escape. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. "Mr. Speaker, there's one more thing we need to discuss." Johnson's voice was barely above a whisper. "My family should be off limits." "Your wife isn't an elected official." "She's not." "Your wife put herself in the public arena," Crockett said, her voice not unkind but firm. "She runs a professional counseling service. She counsels people who are struggling, people who need help. That's a public-facing business. And her business documents, the legal documents that govern how that business operates, express opinions about who deserves to be counseled and who doesn't." She produced one final stack of documents. Kelly Johnson's Onward Christian Counseling Services had an operating agreement. Every business has one. It lays out the rules, the principles, the values that guide the organization. She found the relevant page. In that operating agreement, homosexuality was listed alongside, and I'm reading directly from the document, Mr. Speaker, bestiality and incest. The audience gasped. Even Anderson Cooper's carefully maintained neutrality cracked. His eyebrows rose visibly. "Your wife's professional counseling business, a service that is supposed to help people who are struggling, people who are vulnerable, people who need support, officially compared being gay to having sex with animals." She held up another page. "And here's what's interesting, Mr. Speaker. The language in your wife's counseling business documents is almost identical to language in your Freedom Guard nonprofit from years earlier. Same phrases, same comparisons, same structure." She laid the 2 documents side by side. "It's almost like someone wrote this language once, maybe for your nonprofit, and then copied it into your wife's business documents. Almost like the same hand, the same mind shaped both of these organizations." Johnson's face had gone from pale to gray. "That's been taken out of context." "Then let's add some context." Crockett's voice sharpened. "After HuffPost reported on your wife's website, after they published the language comparing homosexuality to bestiality, what happened to that website?" She paused. "It was taken down, scrubbed from the internet, deleted. Within days of the article being published, the website vanished." She set down the documents. "If there was nothing wrong with it, Mr. Speaker, if it was just being taken out of context, why take it down? Why not leave it up and explain the context? Why not stand behind what you wrote?" Johnson had no answer. "You spent your career comparing gay people to criminals and predators. Your wife's business put those comparisons in official legal documents. And when journalists started asking questions, the evidence disappeared." She shook her head slowly. "That's not context, Mr. Speaker. That's a cover-up. That's what guilty people do when they get caught. They delete the evidence and hope no one noticed." She looked at him with something approaching pity. "But I noticed. And now so has everyone watching. If you think comparing love to bestiality is wrong, if you think LGBTQ+ Americans deserve better than leaders who see them as criminals and predators, type wrong in the comments. Let's see how many of us believe in basic human dignity." Anderson Cooper glanced at his producers. They were over time. They had been over time for 20 minutes. No one had moved to stop the broadcast. The control room had made a decision. This was history. You do cut away from history. "We should wrap up," Cooper said finally. "One final exchange." Crockett nodded. She closed her briefcases, all three of them now empty, their contents scattered across the table like evidence at a crime scene, and turned to face Johnson directly. "Mr. Speaker, you started this whole thing 5 days ago by saying you were absolutely delighted that I'm running for Senate. You rubbed your hands together. You grinned. You said Texas wouldn't buy what I'm selling. You called me the face of the Democratic Party like it was an insult." She paused, letting the memory settle over the audience. "You said you wanted me to have the largest, loudest microphone possible. Well, Mr. Speaker, here I am. You gave me that microphone, and now I'm going to use it to ask you one simple question." She leaned forward. "What exactly am I selling that you find so unacceptable?" Johnson seemed to sense an opportunity, perhaps his last, to funnily go on offense. He straightened slightly in his chair, a ghost of his earlier confidence returning. "Radical left-wing policies that don't represent Texas values," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Open borders, socialism, defunding the police, the woke agenda that's tearing this country apart." "Be specific," Crockett cut him off. "Not talking points. Specific policies. What policy do I support that's so radical?" Johnson hesitated. "Health care," Crockett continued, "because I support making health care more affordable for Texas families. I support making sure people don't go bankrupt because they got sick." "Is that radical?" Johnson opened his mouth, but Crockett kept going. "Education?" "Because I support funding public schools. I support paying teachers a living wage. I support making sure every Texas child has access to a quality education." "Is that radical?" She ticked off another point. "Voting rights." "Because I support making it easier for every Texan to vote. Not harder, easier. I support making sure that when you show up at the polls your vote counts." "Is that radical?" Johnson tried to interject. "You support policies that would." "I support accountability," Crockett said, her voice rising. "That's what I'm really selling, Mr. Speaker. The radical idea that elected officials should be honest, that they should disclose their finances transparently, that they shouldn't spend 8 years working for organizations that the Southern Poverty Law Center calls hate groups, that they shouldn't help plan coups and then cover up the evidence, that they shouldn't need their teenage sons to monitor their internet usage." She stood. "You came here tonight to mock me, to tell Texas I'm too extreme, too radical, too different to represent them. But let me tell you what's actually radical, Mr. Speaker." She began counting on her fingers, her voice ringing through the silent studio. "Having no bank account on $223,000 salary, and refusing to explain where your money goes, that's radical." She raised another finger. "Spending 8 years at an organization that compared gay people to pedophiles, that's radical." Another finger. "Arguing that gay Americans should be criminals, that's radical." Another. "Needing your 17-year-old son to monitor your internet use because you can't trust yourself, that's radical." Another. "Drafting the legal strategy to overturn a presidential election, that's radical." Another. "Blurring security footage to protect people who attacked the United States Capitol, that's radical." She lowered her hand. "I'm not radical, Mr. Speaker. I'm a black woman from Texas who tells the truth. And you're absolutely delighted I'm running because you think Texas won't vote for someone who looks like me, who talks like me, who fights like me. You think Texans will look at me and see a threat. You think they'll look at you and see a leader." She smiled. Not the receipt smile, but something warmer, more genuine. "But here's what I think. I think Texans are smarter than you give them credit for. I think they can tell the difference between someone who fights for them and someone who fights for hate groups and insurrectionists. I think they know a fraud when they see one. And Mr. Speaker, after tonight, they've definitely seen one." She gathered her briefcases. "You said you wanted me to have the largest, loudest microphone possible. Well, congratulations. You just gave it to me. You brought me on national television. You gave me 2 hours to show America who you really are, and I used every minute of it." She turned toward the exit, then paused and looked back at Johnson. "Texas deserves better than a speaker who can't explain his finances, can't defend his legal record, can't justify his work for a hate group, and can't face his own internet history without help from a teenager." She smiled one last time. "Oh, and Mr. Speaker, you said good luck with that when you mocked my campaign. Well, here's the thing about luck. I don't need it. I have receipts. She paused at the edge of the stage. Good luck with that. The Democratic half of the audience exploded. The standing ovation lasted nearly 2 full minutes. Even some Republicans were applauding, not for Crockett's politics necessarily, but for the sheer undeniable totality of what they had just witnessed. They had come to see a debate. They had witnessed a demolition. Mike Johnson sat alone under the studio lights, a broken man in a rumpled suit with nothing left to say. His handlers were already making their way toward him, already preparing damage control statements, already knowing that no statement would be enough. The most powerful man in Congress had been systematically dismantled by the woman he had spent 5 days mocking, and he had no one to blame but himself. What you just heard happened last night. Right now, as you're listening to this, the aftermath is still unfolding in real time. Let me tell you what's happening right now and what's going to happen next. The clips are everywhere. They're spreading faster than any political moment in recent memory. That absolutely delighted to absolutely prison clip has been viewed 45 million times since midnight, and that number is climbing by hundreds of thousands every hour. #Johnson destroyed is trending in 42 countries. #receipt smile is trending in 38. #hard truth Texas just hit the top 10. The memes are multiplying faster than anyone can track. Someone already made a supercut of every time Johnson said absolutely delighted over the past 5 days, ending with Crockett's "You should be absolutely delighted you're not in prison." It's a 15 million views and climbing. Someone else created a Covenant Eyes filter that blurs your face and adds the text accountability partner needed. It's been used over 1 million times since this morning. There's a clip making the rounds of just Crockett saying "I have receipts" 3 seconds long. That's been used as a reaction video to everything from relationship drama to political scandals. As I'm recording this, it's the #1 sound on TikTok. Fox News is struggling, and I mean really struggling. This morning's coverage tried to spin it as a liberal ambush. But the problem is that Crockett didn't use liberal talking points. She used Johnson's own words, his own financial disclosures, his own legal briefs, his own organization's documents. There's nothing to spin when the receipts are this clear. Sean Hannity's show last night didn't mention the town hall at all. Not a single word. Hannity, who has had Johnson on his show dozens of times, who has praised him as a constitutional conservative, who helped amplify the absolutely delighted mockery, went completely silent. That silence tells you everything you need to know about how bad this is for Johnson. Tucker Carlson's replacement tried a different approach. He attacked Crockett's tone and suggested she was disrespectful. It didn't land. When you've just watched a man get demolished by facts, complaining about the demolisher's tone sounds desperate. The Wall Street Journal just published an editorial titled, "The Speaker Has Questions to Answer." When the Journal, the paper of record for American business conservatives, turns on a Republican, the party pays attention, and they're paying attention now. The fundraising numbers are staggering. In the 14 hours since the town hall ended, Jasmine Crockett's campaign has raised $9.2 million. That's more than most Senate candidates raise in an entire quarter. The ActBlue page crashed 3 times from traffic. They had to add server capacity overnight. But here's what happens next. As we've seen this pattern before, when someone gets destroyed this badly on live television, the aftermath unfolds in stages. Stage 1 is the viral moment that's happening right now. The clips are spreading. The memes are multiplying. The hashtags are trending. This is the immediate shockwave. Stage 2 is the media scramble that started this morning and will continue through the weekend. Watch the Sunday shows tomorrow. See who's willing to defend Johnson and who suddenly has pre-existing conflicts. See who says he made some good points and who says that was a disaster. Stage 3 is the polling. Give it 3 to 5 days. Someone is already in the field, I guarantee it. Johnson's approval rating among independents is about to crater. Watch for double-digit drops. Watch for the crosstabs showing even Republicans wincing. Stage 4 is the distancing. This is where it gets painful. Within a week, maybe 2, Republican colleagues will start finding reasons to skip events with Johnson. They'll praise him in public and avoid him in private. The fundraising requests will slow down. the joint appearances will dry up. No one wants to be photographed next to a man who just got humiliated on national television. Watch for Trump. He's been quiet about the town hall so far, unusually quiet. But Trump doesn't tolerate weakness. And what happened last night was weakness. It was a Republican leader walking into an obvious trap and getting destroyed. Don't be surprised if you see a Truth Social post in